Elizabeth Warren pointed her finger at Lauren Boebert across the banking committee table and declared, "You're nothing but a puppet for Wall Street, and you don't understand what working families go through." Warren's voice was filled with that familiar populist anger, but what she didn't know was that Boebert had done her research on Warren's own wealth accumulation. Boebert's response about Warren's million-dollar salary and real estate portfolio would completely expose the hypocrisy of a Harvard professor lecturing a former restaurant owner about working-class struggles. What happened next would destroy Warren's fake populist image forever. The House Banking Committee hearing room was buzzing with anticipation on this particular Tuesday morning in Washington. The ornate chamber, with its mahogany panels and formal portraits, had witnessed countless financial policy debates over the decades. But what was about to unfold would become one of the most devastating exposures of progressive hypocrisy in congressional history. The hearing was focused on financial regulations and their impact on small businesses, a topic that should have brought thoughtful bipartisan discussion. Instead, it had become another platform for Elizabeth Warren to perform her signature populist theater, complete with finger-pointing and righteous indignation designed more for viral clips than substantive policy discussion. Warren sat confidently at her position on the committee, her gray hair perfectly styled, her expression radiating the kind of moral superiority that had made her a hero to progressives and a target for conservatives. She wore her usual professional attire, projecting the image of a serious academic who had reluctantly entered politics to fight for the common people against powerful interests. Her entire political brand was built on this narrative. The Harvard professor who understood the struggles of working families, the former bankruptcy lawyer who had seen how the system failed ordinary Americans, the champion of the middle class who was willing to take on Wall Street and corporate power. It was a compelling story, and Warren had used it to build a national political career and a devoted following among progressive activists. Across the committee table sat Lauren Boebert, reviewing her notes with the quiet intensity that had become her trademark. She wore a simple black blazer, her appearance professional but unpretentious, reflecting her background as someone who had actually worked in the service industry before entering politics. Her expression was focused and alert, and there was something in her eyes that suggested she was prepared for whatever Warren might throw at her. The committee had been hearing testimony from various financial industry representatives and small business advocates, discussing the impact of regulatory compliance costs on entrepreneurship and job creation. The conversation had been relatively civil until Warren decided to use the moment to launch one of her signature attacks on Republican committee members. Warren had been waiting for the right opportunity to deploy her populist rhetoric, and she sensed her moment when the discussion turned to the balance between consumer protection and business formation. This was her wheelhouse, the intersection of financial policy and class warfare that had made her a progressive icon. "Mr. Chairman," Warren said, her voice cutting through the routine discussion with unmistakable authority, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room here. We're having a discussion about financial regulations, as if all of us in this room have the same commitment to protecting working families from predatory financial practices." She paused dramatically, her gaze sweeping across the Republican side of the committee table. "But the truth is, some of my colleagues here seem more interested in protecting Wall Street profits than protecting the American people who get hurt when big banks and financial corporations are allowed to run wild." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the room could sense that Warren was building up to something bigger. This wasn't going to be a general policy critique. This was going to be a targeted attack designed to create a viral moment and score political points with her progressive base. "We've heard testimony today about the burden of compliance costs," Warren continued, her voice growing more pointed. "But what we haven't heard is any acknowledgement of why these regulations exist in the first place. They exist because working families got crushed by a financial crisis that was caused by exactly the kind of deregulation that some of my colleagues continue to advocate for." Her finger began to rise, the signature gesture that had become synonymous with Warren's confrontational style. "We've heard complaints about the costs of oversight, But what we haven't heard is any concern for the costs that working families pay when banks are allowed to engage in predatory lending, when credit card companies are allowed to trap people in debt, when financial advisors are allowed to cheat their clients. The room was growing tense, and Democratic committee members were leaning forward with anticipation. They had seen Warren deploy this strategy countless times before, using populist rhetoric to paint Republicans as defenders of Wall Street against the interests of ordinary Americans. That's when Warren made her move, her finger pointing directly at Boebert like an accusation made flesh. "Representative Boebert," she said, her voice rising with indignation, "you've been sitting there advocating for reduced oversight of financial institutions, for rolling back consumer protections, for making it easier for banks to do whatever they want without accountability." The attack was becoming personal now, and everyone in the room could feel the energy shifting. Warren wasn't just critiquing policies anymore. She was attacking Boebert's character and motivations. "You're nothing but puppet for Wall Street," Warren declared, her voice echoing through the chamber with righteous fury. "And you don't understand what working families go through when they get cheated by predatory lenders, when they get trapped in debt by credit card companies, when they get sold financial products that are designed to benefit banks rather than consumers." The accusation was devastating in its directness, and Warren clearly believed she had delivered a knockout blow. She leaned back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone who had just scored a major political victory, expecting Boebert to either remain silent or offer some weak defense that would only make Warren look stronger by comparison. But what Warren didn't realize was that she had just made the same mistake that had destroyed so many other establishment politicians who had underestimated Lauren Boebert. She had assumed that her academic credentials and progressive rhetoric would be enough to intimidate someone she clearly viewed as an intellectual inferior. What Warren didn't know was that Boebert had been doing her homework, researching Warren's own financial history, her wealth accumulation, her real estate holdings, and her sources of income. Warren had just accused someone who had actually lived paycheck to paycheck of being out of touch with working families, while hiding her own millionaire status behind a facade of populist concern. "Mr. Chairman," Boebert said, her voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made everyone in the room pay attention, "I'd like to respond to the accusations that have just been made against me." The chairman nodded, and Boebert stood up slowly, her movement deliberate and controlled. She didn't look angry or defensive. She looked like someone who had been handed an opportunity to expose something important. "Thank you, Elizabeth," Boebert said, her voice carrying across the room with unmistakable authority, "for that passionate defense of working families. I'm particularly impressed by your concern for people who struggle to make ends meet, people who live paycheck to paycheck, people who have to worry about paying their bills every month." She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze steady and unwavering. "But I have to ask you something, and I think everyone in this room would be interested in your answer. When was the last time you actually lived paycheck to paycheck, Elizabeth? When was the last time you worried about making rent or buying groceries or keeping your business afloat?" The question hit the room like a thunderbolt, and Warren's confident expression began to falter slightly. But Boebert was just getting started. "You see, Elizabeth, while you've been lecturing me about understanding working families, I've been looking at your financial disclosure forms. And what I've found is fascinating. According to your own reported income, you made over $400,000 a year as a Harvard professor. That's before your book deals, your speaking fees, and your other sources of income." The data was beginning to flow, and everyone in the room could sense that something significant was about to be revealed. Warren sat rigid in her chair, her populist confidence suddenly looking much less secure. "For $100,000 a year, Elizabeth," Boebert repeated, letting the number sink in. "That puts you in the top 1% of income earners in America. The same 1% that you spend so much time attacking in your speeches and your books." She pulled out a document from her folder. "But it gets better. According to public records, you own a house in Cambridge worth $5.4 million. You also own a house in Washington, D.C. worth $3.2 million. That's $8.6 million in real estate alone, Elizabeth. How exactly does that qualify you to lecture anyone about understanding working-class struggles?" The revelation was devastating, and the room fell into stunned silence. Here was Warren, the supposed champion of working families, revealed as a multimillionaire with a real estate portfolio worth more than most Americans would see in a lifetime. "You called me a puppet for Wall Street," Boebert continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "But let's talk about where your money actually comes from. Your book deals alone have earned you millions of dollars. Your speaking fees range from $50,000 to $100,000 per appearance. You've made a fortune selling the image of yourself as a champion of the common people." She looked around the committee room, making eye contact with other members. "Meanwhile, I actually was one of those working families you claim to care about. I worked in restaurants, I struggled to pay bills, I built a business from nothing while you were making hundreds of thousands of dollars teaching at Harvard." The contrast was stark and undeniable. Here was Warren, the wealthy academic, being exposed by someone who had actually lived the struggles that Warren only talked about in theoretical terms. "But here's what really bothers me about your approach, Elizabeth," Boebert said, her voice taking on a tone of genuine concern. "You've made a career out of claiming to represent working families while accumulating wealth that puts you further from those families than most of the Wall Street executives you attack." The accusation was particularly powerful because it highlighted the fundamental hypocrisy of Warren's political brand. How could someone who lived such a privileged lifestyle credibly claim to understand the struggles of ordinary Americans? "You talk about predatory lending," Boebert continued, "but you've never had to worry about getting a loan denied because of your income. You talk about credit card debt, but you've never had to choose between paying your credit card bill and buying groceries. You talk about financial struggles, but you live in mansions worth millions of dollars." She began walking around the committee table, her energy commanding the room's attention. "I understand working families because I was one. I understand small business struggles because I live them. I understand what it means to risk everything on a dream because I did it, not because I studied it in some academic setting." The room was completely captivated now. This wasn't just a policy debate anymore. This was a fundamental confrontation between authentic experience and performative populism. "You want to know what's really predatory, Elizabeth?" Boebert asked, her voice rising with conviction. "What's predatory is a millionaire professor convincing working families that she understands their struggles while living a lifestyle they could never afford. What's predatory is using populist rhetoric to build a political career while accumulating wealth that separates you from the very people you claim to represent." The attack was devastating because it struck at the heart of Warren's political identity. Her entire brand was built on being the champion of working families against powerful elites, but she had been revealed as one of those elites herself. "Let me tell you what I learned from actually being a working family," Boebert continued, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "I learned that government regulations don't just hurt big businesses. They hurt small businesses too. I learned that compliance costs aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're real expenses that real entrepreneurs have to pay with real money they often don't have." She stopped directly across from Warren, her gaze intense and unwavering. "I learned that when politicians make it harder to start a business, they're not just hurting abstract entities called corporations. They're hurting people like me who want to create something, who want to employ others, who want to build a better life through hard work and determination." The distinction was crucial, and everyone in the room understood it. There was a fundamental difference between understanding policy impacts in theory and experiencing them in practice. "But you wouldn't know about any of that, would you, Elizabeth?" Boebert asked, her voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "You've never had to meet payroll. You've never had to decide whether you can afford to hire another employee. You've never had to choose between compliance costs and keeping your business afloat." She pulled out another document. "Speaking of compliance costs, let me share something interesting. The average small business spends about $83,000 per year on regulatory compliance. That's more than many working families earn in total income. But for someone making $400,000 a year as a professor, that might seem like a small price to pay for the theoretical benefits of regulation." The data was hitting hard. highlighting the disconnect between Warren's academic understanding and the real-world impact of the policies she advocated. "You called me a Wall Street puppet," Boebert said, her voice becoming more pointed. "But let's talk about who's really connected to financial elites. You've taken money from law firms that represent major banks. You've received donations from financial industry executives. You've participated in the same revolving door between academia, government, and high-paying private sector jobs that characterizes the Washington establishment you claim to oppose." The accusations were backed by documentation, and Warren seemed unable to formulate an effective response. Her populist confidence was crumbling under the weight of evidence about her own privileged status. "But here's the most revealing part of your financial story," Boebert continued, pulling out what appeared to be the most damaging document yet. "Let's talk about how you built your wealth, Elizabeth. Let's talk about your house-flipping business in the 1990s, when you were buying distressed properties, renovating them, and selling them for profit." The revelation was particularly devastating because it contradicted Warren's narrative about corporate greed and exploitation. "You bought a house in Oklahoma City for $30,000 and sold it for $145,000. You bought a house in Norman for $61,000 and sold it for $109,000. You were literally profiting from the kind of real estate speculation that you now criticize when other people do it." Warren's face had gone pale, and her earlier confidence had completely evaporated. She had been caught in the ultimate hypocrisy, building personal wealth through the exact practices she condemned in others. "So when you lecture me about Wall Street connections," Boebert said, her voice reaching a crescendo, "remember that you made your money through real estate speculation. When you attack me for supporting business-friendly policies, remember that you built your wealth by buying and selling properties for profit. When you claim to understand working families, remember that you were making hundreds of thousands of dollars while they were struggling to make ends meet." The room was completely silent now, everyone absorbing the devastating exposure of Warren's hypocrisy. This wasn't just about policy differences anymore. This was about the fundamental authenticity of Warren's populist brand. "You want to know what a real champion of working families looks like?" Boebert asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had actually lived the experiences she was describing. "It's not someone who makes $400,000 a year lecturing about other people's privilege. It's not someone who owns multiple million-dollar homes while talking about income inequality. It's not someone who made their money through real estate speculation while criticizing others for doing the same thing." She looked around the committee room one final time. A real champion of working families is someone who actually came from working families. Someone who understands what it's like to struggle because they've actually struggled. Someone who supports policies that create opportunities because they know what it's like to need those opportunities. The distinction was clear and powerful. Authentic representation versus performative populism. Real experience versus academic theory. Genuine understanding versus political calculation. "I didn't come to Congress to lecture people about struggles I've never faced," Boebert continued, her voice reflecting both humility and strength. "I came here to fight for the opportunities that allowed me to build a better life, to create jobs, to contribute to my community. I came here to make sure that other working families have the same chances that I had." She began gathering her papers, but her final words would echo in that room long after the hearing was over. "So, Elizabeth, the next time you want to call someone a Wall Street puppet, maybe you should look in the mirror. The next time you want to lecture someone about understanding working families, maybe you should remember that some of us actually were working families. And the next time you want to attack someone for their connections to financial elites, maybe you should examine your own wealth, your own real estate empire, and your own privileged lifestyle." The silence that followed was profound and complete. Warren sat motionless, her populist facade completely shattered by the weight of evidence about her own hypocrisy. Her signature finger-pointing and righteous indignation had been turned against her, revealing the hollow core of her political brand. Other committee members began to stir, some nodding slightly, others staring at their notes, processing what they had just witnessed. This hadn't been just a policy debate. This had been a fundamental education in the difference between authentic populism and manufactured political personas. The confrontation between Elizabeth Warren and Lauren Boebert had exposed something crucial about modern American politics: the growing disconnect between progressive rhetoric and progressive reality. It had highlighted the danger of allowing wealthy elites to pose as champions of working families, while living lifestyles that separated them completely from the people they claimed to represent. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that all the populist rhetoric in the world couldn't overcome the simple truth that authenticity mattered more than academic credentials, that real experience trumped theoretical knowledge, and that voters could eventually see through performative politics to recognize genuine representation. The age of unquestioned progressive populism was over. The age of demanding authenticity from political leaders had begun. And it had started with a former restaurant owner from Colorado who had the courage to challenge a millionaire professor from Massachusetts with the most powerful weapon in politics: the truth about who she really was.